In the centuries leading up to the dawn of the Viking Age, Scandinavia sat at the edge of the known world, largely untouched by the great civilizations of the Mediterranean that had shaped so much of ancient Europe. Yet this remoteness did not mean the region was culturally frozen or without its own dynamic societies. Numerous Germanic peoples were spread across a vast and varied landscape, living in coastal villages and scattered inland farmsteads, and the terrain itself, thick with forest and lacking any real network of roads, meant that traveling overland was slow and arduous. From the deep fjords carved into Norway's coast to the flat, low islands of Denmark and the sprawling lakes and rivers threading through Sweden, water was the natural highway of the north, and it was along these waterways that people, goods, and ideas moved. By around the 6th century, Scandinavian communities had organized themselves around kinship ties, with local chieftains rising to prominence through the land they controlled, the loyalty of their retinues, and their record of success in both battle and commerce. Power in this world was never centralized. Instead, it was split among countless competing local lords, each vying for a limited supply of farmland and resources. This scarcity pushed many Scandinavians to look outward, building long-distance trading relationships across the continent to secure what they could not find at home. And it was this mixture of political fragmentation, resource pressure, and a trade-oriented outlook that laid the groundwork for what would become the Viking Age. A crucial ingredient in this transformation was the steady refinement of Norse shipbuilding. By the 8th century, shipwrights in Scandinavia had mastered the clinker-built hull, producing vessels that were remarkably light for their strength and versatile enough to be rowed, sailed, or dragged overland when necessary. The most celebrated of these designs was the longship, narrow, shallow-drafted, and built for both speed and agility on the water. The grandest examples stretched close to 30 meters and could carry crews approaching 100 men, sometimes finished with carved dragon figureheads at bow and stern. These ships were never purely instruments of trade, they doubled as tools of war, and as a result, the culture that grew up around them blurred the line between merchant voyage and raiding expedition, treating both as expressions of the same seafaring way of life. By the 7th century, Norse traders had already carved out a foothold in the markets and towns ringing the Baltic and North Sea, and through these commercial contacts they gathered more than goods. They learned about far-off lands, which regions held wealth, which settlements were poorly guarded, and how instability elsewhere in Europe might be turned to their advantage. From this environment, seasonal raiding emerged not as a break from trading tradition but as a natural extension of it, offering a quicker and often more rewarding path to riches and status. Wealth gained through both trade and raid flowed back to the chieftains, who redistributed it among their followers, cementing bonds of loyalty and allowing ambitious leaders to build ever larger war bands and fleets that could be marshaled for bigger expeditions. It was against this backdrop that history recorded its first major Viking assault at the close of the 8th century. In the year 793, raiders struck the undefended monastery on the island of Lindisfarne off England's northeastern coast, killing a number of monks and making off with considerable treasure. To the Christian world, this attack on a sacred site felt like a shocking act of pagan sacrilege. But from the Viking perspective, an isolated monastery loaded with valuables and lightly defended was simply too tempting a target to pass up, and the raid set a pattern others would soon follow. Throughout the 790s, and into the opening years of the 9th century, Norse raiders continued to hit island monasteries and coastal settlements around the Irish Sea and North Sea, striking in summer when conditions allowed easy sailing, and then returning home before winter set in. These early raids proved so profitable that ambitions grew, and Viking fleets began pushing further inland by following Europe's major rivers to reach wealthier targets. In 845, a fleet of some 120 longships sailed up the Seine and sacked Paris itself, only withdrawing once a substantial ransom had been paid, and similar episodes of raiding followed by extortion played out along the Loire and Thames in the decades that followed. Around 850, Norse strategy shifted again as raiders began wintering in England rather than sailing home each season, establishing a more permanent foothold from which they could inflict damage over a much wider territory than seasonal raids alone ever could. A comparable pattern had already unfolded in Ireland a few years earlier, when Vikings sailing up the River Liffey built a fortified base on the shore that would eventually grow into the city of Dublin, founded in 841. Norse influence around the Irish Sea only deepened in the years that followed, with additional settlements taking root at Waterford, Limerick, Wexford, and Cork. Yet the Norse presence in Ireland was never simply a matter of isolated coastal outposts, since settlers frequently integrated into local Irish life, forming alliances, intermarrying with Irish families, and blending customs and language with their neighbors, giving rise to a hybrid Norse Gaelic culture that came to dominate the sea lanes around Ireland and into Scotland. A similar story of raiding followed by settlement and eventual assimilation played out across Shetland, Orkney, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man, creating a chain of Viking-influenced territories stretching along Europe's Atlantic edge, all linked back to the Scandinavian homeland. Norse expansion was not confined to northern waters, however, as raiders also pushed south during the mid-9th century, striking targets along the coasts of Iberia, North Africa, and even venturing into the Mediterranean, with cities including Lisbon, Seville, and Pisa all suffering attacks at various points. These southern raids continued sporadically for years, but in 865 a far more consequential shift took place. That autumn, a massive Norse fleet landed on England's southeastern coast, and this time the goal was not plunder but permanent conquest and settlement. This force, remembered in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as the Great Heathen Army, was said to be led by the sons of the legendary warlord Ragnar Lothbrok, seeking vengeance for their father's death after King Aelle of Northumbria supposedly had him executed in a pit of venomous snakes. Whatever truth lies behind the legend, a formidable Viking army soon swept across eastern England, capturing York in 866 and transforming it into the heart of the Scandinavian-ruled territory of Jorvik. In the following years, the invaders turned south to overrun East Anglia and much of Mercia, leaving Wessex as the sole Anglo-Saxon kingdom still standing, its resistance led by King Alfred the Great, who fought to hold back the Norse advance and preserve what remained of Anglo-Saxon rule. By 878, Alfred's forces had defeated the Great Heathen Army at the Battle of Edington, and the resulting settlement allowed the Vikings to keep control over a large swath of eastern and northern England that became known as the Danelaw. What followed was a lasting demographic and cultural shift, as more settlers arrived from Scandinavia to farm the land and build communities, and this influx left a permanent mark on the English language, contributing everyday words like give, take, sky, skull, egg, and window, along with countless place names still in use today. The martial skill of the Vikings earned them a fearsome and respected reputation wherever they fought, and while their raids and conquests unfolded in the west, an entirely different pattern of expansion was taking shape to the east, across the Baltic Sea. Swedish Vikings, often known as the Varangians, developed extensive trade routes along the river systems of Eastern Europe, linking the Baltic to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Furs, wax, honey, and amber traveled south from Scandinavia in exchange for silver, fine textiles, and luxury items sourced from as far away as the Mediterranean world and Baghdad. Much as their kinsmen had done in the British Isles and Western Europe, the Norse traders who ventured east into what is today Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine gradually merged with the local Slavic populations, embedding themselves in regional political life and producing mixed Norse-Slavic communities. In 862, a Norse leader named Rurik took power over Novgorod, and 2 decades later in 882, one of his followers Oleg seized control of Kiev, establishing the foundations of Kievan Rus, a state that would remain a dominant force in Eastern Europe for the next 4 centuries. These eastern trade routes eventually brought Norse traders into contact with what was then the wealthiest and largest city in the world, Constantinople. The Byzantine capital offered an almost overwhelming array of goods and treasures, and its riches proved so tempting that combined Scandinavian and Rus fleets launched several attempted assaults on the city over the years. Although relations later grew more peaceful, this contact eventually gave rise to the famous Varangian Guard, formed around 988 as the elite personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors. Prized for their fierce loyalty and formidable skill in combat, the Guard was recruited almost entirely from Rus and Scandinavian warriors, making it a distinctly Norse institution within an otherwise overwhelmingly Greek imperial court. As Norse peoples traveled, traded, raided, and settled across such a wide expanse of the known world, Scandinavia itself began to change as a result of the ideas, customs, and influences its people brought home. Up to this point, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden remained divided into a shifting patchwork of rival chiefdoms and minor kingdoms, held together loosely by a shared set of mutually understandable dialects that made up the Old Norse language, as well as a common set of religious beliefs centered on the Old Norse pantheon. Gods such as Odin, associated with wisdom, poetry, and war, and Thor, linked to thunder, strength, and protection, existed within a rich mythological framework that also included elves, dwarves, and trolls. And although much of this belief system survived only later through the written sagas, the fractured political landscape of the Viking world began to give way to consolidation as the 10th century progressed, driven in part by the spread of Christianity and the rise of unified kingdoms. Denmark led this transformation, with royal authority already beginning to solidify near the end of the 9th century, though it was under Harald Bluetooth in the mid-10th century that the process accelerated decisively, as Christianity was formally embraced and Denmark took shape as the first clearly recognizable medieval kingdom in the region. Sweden, by contrast, was the slowest of the three to centralize, remaining divided among competing regional factions throughout the 9th and 10th centuries, with Christianity only gaining real traction among the ruling class around the turn of the millennium, when Olaf Skirkenung became the first Swedish king to be baptized and to issue coinage bearing Christian symbols, though it would still take roughly another century and a half before Sweden emerged as a genuinely unified Christian kingdom. Since royal and ecclesiastical power remained comparatively weak for a long time afterward, Norway's road to statehood proved even rockier and more violent. Tradition holds that the Battle of Hafrsfjord in the late 9th century marked the unification of the country under Harald Fairhair, although historians generally view the actual process as far slower and messier, unfolding gradually across the 10th century as power continued to shift between rival regional rulers and resistance to Christian conversion remained strong in many areas. This drawn-out consolidation of royal power bred deep resentment in various parts of the country, especially in the western fjord regions where local chieftains resisted submitting to a distant king, and many of these disaffected leaders chose instead to leave Norway entirely in search of new lands where they could live on their own terms, fueling a fresh wave of Norse expansion and settlement. Unlike the pattern seen elsewhere in Europe, where Viking activity typically began with raiding and sometimes led to conquest, the westward push into the North Atlantic was defined almost from the start by peaceful settlement, largely because the lands being reached were uninhabited. Iceland was the first major destination, discovered and settled by Norse sailors as early as the 870s, with additional waves of settlers arriving over the following decades, some coming straight from Norway and others from Norse communities already established around the Irish Sea. Iceland offered a blank slate in terms of political structure, and the settlers who built lives there eventually created a governing body known as the Althing, a general assembly that met annually to establish laws and resolve disputes, functioning in many ways as an early form of representative government. From this Icelandic base, Norse expansion continued further west toward Greenland. In 985, an Icelandic chieftain named Eric the Red, having been exiled from his homeland, set sail in search of new territory, and eventually succeeded in gathering a group of settlers who established communities along Greenland's southwestern coastline despite the region's remoteness and harsh conditions, making it the farthest permanent Norse settlement in the known world. Even this was not the final limit of Norse exploration, however, as expeditions launched from Greenland around the year 1000 reached the coast of North America. Under the leadership of Leif Erikson, Norse explorers charted portions of what is now eastern Canada and built a short-lived base at the site now known as Elant's Ox Meadows in Newfoundland. There they encountered indigenous peoples they referred to as Skraelings, and while relations were occasionally peaceful, they were more often marked by hostility, and ultimately the combination of vast distance from other Norse settlements, limited manpower and the ongoing threat of conflict convinced the Vikings that maintaining a permanent presence in Newfoundland was not feasible, leading them to abandon the settlement after only a brief period of occupation. Despite its short existence, the fact that Norse explorers reached North America at all stands as remarkable testimony to their seafaring skill, since Europeans would not set foot on the continent again for roughly another 500 years. By the time the new millennium arrived, the Viking Age had reached the height of its influence, even as signs of decline were already becoming apparent. Back in the British Isles, the territory held under the Danelaw had gradually been retaken by Anglo-Saxon forces over the course of the early 10th century, and was formally absorbed into a unified Kingdom of England in 927. Norse forces attempted to reassert themselves by force at the Battle of Brunanbar a decade later in 937, but their defeat at the hands of King Athelstan significantly weakened their position in England going forward, although regions in the north and east continued to retain a strong Scandinavian cultural character and lingering loyalty to Norse leaders. This set the stage for a renewed surge of Viking activity in England during the latter part of the 10th century, as Danish raiders once again began targeting the country. Following a series of poor political decisions by the English King Ethelred in the early 11th century, the Danish king Sweyn Forkbeard launched a full invasion and claimed the English throne for himself in 1013, and his son Sinutt completed the conquest 3 years later, ultimately forging a North Sea empire that united England, Denmark, and later Norway under a single ruler. This empire, however, proved short-lived in practical terms, since Sinutt's death in 1035 triggered succession disputes that undermined the empire's stability, and by 1042 the English throne had reverted back to the Anglo-Saxon line under Edward the Confessor. Even so, England remained closely tied to Scandinavia both politically and socially, a lingering connection that would soon play a direct role in one of the most consequential events in European history. Meanwhile, across the Irish Sea, a parallel story was unfolding, as native Irish rulers increasingly challenged the independence and authority of Norse-founded towns such as Dublin during the late 10th and early 11th centuries. Tensions came to a head in 1014 at the Battle of Clontarf, where the Irish High King Brian Boru led his forces to victory over a combined army of Norsemen and their Irish allies. And although Brian himself was killed during the fighting, his triumph effectively marked the end of significant Viking political power in Ireland. Norse communities did remain in the country afterward, but over time they were absorbed increasingly into Gaelic culture and society, eventually disappearing as a distinct ethnic identity altogether. The event most widely regarded as marking the true end of the Viking Age took place in 1066. After King Edward the Confessor died without a direct heir, the English throne became the subject of a contested succession involving three rival claimants. Harold Godwinson was chosen by the English nobility to become king, but across the North Sea, Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, believed his own ancestral ties to the earlier North Sea Empire gave him a legitimate claim, and he assembled an invasion force to press that claim by arms. Hardrada's army landed in England and won an initial victory, but Harold Godwinson responded swiftly, marching his forces north and meeting the Norwegian invaders at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September, where Hardrada was killed in the fighting, reportedly struck through the throat by an arrow, bringing an end to what would prove to be the final large-scale Viking invasion of England. At almost the same moment, however, another challenger was preparing to cross the English Channel, William, Duke of Normandy, who had assembled his own army to pursue his claim to the throne. In something of a historical irony, Normandy itself had originally been founded by Vikings back in the 10th century, when the Norse leader Rollo was granted land there by the king of the Franks in return for pledging loyalty and converting to Christianity. And over the following generations, Rollo's descendants and followers gradually blended into the surrounding French population, largely losing their original Scandinavian identity, much as Norse settlers had done in other parts of Europe. It was this Norman force, French-speaking and only distantly Norse in culture despite its Viking origins, that defeated Harold Godwinson's exhausted army at the Battle of Hastings on the 14th of October 1066, an event that is widely seen as bringing the Viking Age to its symbolic close. As Europe moved into the High Middle Ages, the lasting influence of the Vikings gradually blended into the broader medieval society they had helped shape across much of Western Europe, with Norse settlers steadily merging into local populations until they became largely indistinguishable from their neighbors. In England, Normandy, and Ireland, Norse communities were absorbed within only a handful of generations, though their imprint remained visible for centuries afterward in vocabulary, place names, and patterns of settlement still recognizable today. In Scotland, Norse influence endured somewhat longer in the Northern and Western Isles, which stayed under Norwegian control for an extended period before eventually being incorporated into the Scottish kingdom. Beyond the British Isles, Viking expansion also began to recede as political circumstances shifted elsewhere. In the North Atlantic, Norse settlements in Greenland were slowly abandoned over the course of the next several centuries, while Iceland gradually lost its political independence and was formally brought under Norwegian rule in 1262. In Eastern Europe, Kievan Rus continued to grow into a major and expansive state between the 10th and 13th centuries, though its original Scandinavian character faded steadily as Slavic language, culture, and political institutions came to dominate. Further south, Varangian warriors continued serving as elite soldiers within the Byzantine military for centuries, remaining an important component of Constantinople's forces right up until the city finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Within Scandinavia itself, however, the most profound transformation of all took place, as Denmark, Norway, and Sweden each developed into centralized Christian kingdoms defined by hereditary succession, fixed borders, formal legal codes, and integration into the broader feudal order of medieval Europe. As raiding gradually gave way to organized taxation and loosely organized warrior retinues evolved into structured royal armies, the distinctive social and religious character of the Viking Age was steadily replaced by the institutions of stable, centralized monarchies. By the time this long process had run its course, the Vikings had effectively ceased to exist as a distinct people with their own separate way of life, not because they were ever conquered or destroyed outright, but because wherever they traveled across the medieval world, they adapted to new circumstances, absorbed the cultures they encountered, and ultimately assimilated so thoroughly into the societies around them that their unique identity dissolved into the wider fabric of medieval Europe and beyond.